Hello fellow collectors, I hope you are doing wonderfully well. Today we continue on with my monthly series where I talk about the best films I watched in the preceding month, and today we tackle my October. I'm a little later with this video than I was hoping to be because unfortunately I wasn't too well for the first couple of weeks of November, which has set me back a little bit, but thankfully I've just managed to squeeze this one in before we hit December. For me, October was a much more average month of film watching. I have, however, been very much focused on reducing my watch list as much as possible, and it's something that I'll no doubt be focused on until the end of the year. And I've actually been really keen to finally watch some of the oldest titles still sat on my shelves that I haven't seen yet. And to my shame, a few films I watched in October I actually picked up all the way back in 2021. And so, despite a few being more average watches, I've actually been really happy to tick a few off my watch list that I've been waiting for far too long. But thankfully there's still plenty to talk about today because I still watched some fantastic stuff. Anyway, that is more than enough of a preamble from me, so let's get right into it and talk about the best films I watched in October. First up, and we have Red Rock West, a film from 1993 and directed by John Dahl, who you might know as the director of The Last Seduction with Linda Florentino, a sort of neo-noir remake of Double Indemnity, though for me nowhere near as good, but an interesting film nonetheless. In Red Rock West though, we have a great cast with Nicolas Cage, Dennis Hopper, Laura Flynn Boyle and JT Walsh. And I have here the absolutely lovely edition from Umbrella Entertainment out of Australia. Sadly, I missed out on their bigger box set release of this, but their slipcover release is still fantastic. This one was just an absolute blast and enormous fun almost from start to finish. It's a neo-noir done very well indeed, with a great atmosphere to it of danger, suspense, recklessness, and plenty of moments where you'll be shouting, "What are you doing? Get out of there!" We have Nicolas Cage playing our protagonist, who is a man rocking the double denim, down on his luck and hundreds of miles away from his home. And he's just passing through a small town on his way to look for work, and then gets caught up in a deadly conspiracy involving corruption, crime and murder. I was just in the perfect mood for this one when I watched it, and I just let it sweep me away for an hour and a half. Now, it's not perfect by any stretch, but I think it's a film where you just need to suspend your disbelief, not question things too much, and just go with the flow and let the story carry you away. Does everything make logical sense? Definitely not. Does it all work perfectly well together? Again, definitely not. But it doesn't have to, because there is almost a rush from watching this one, as it keeps you incredibly engaged in the story with plenty of twists and turns. I will say that I didn't love the ending here, I found it a little lackluster, but aside from that there was so much to enjoy. I was laughing out loud at some of the unexpected madness, and as you might expect from a film with Dennis Hopper, it's a pretty wild ride that gives you surprise after surprise and keeps you guessing. Hopper is of course delightfully unhinged. Cage is channeling something similar to his later Con Air character as a former Marine, and Laura Flynn Boyle is the perfect mixture of sultry and dangerous. Overall, a very engaging watch and just a whole lot of fun. Next up, and we have The Parallax View. From 1974 and directed by Alan J. Pakula, this one is the second film of his Paranoia trilogy, which also includes Clute and All the President's Men. This one stars Warren Beatty, Paula Prentice, William Daniels, Walter McGinn and Hume Cronin, who is an actor that I grow to appreciate more and more with each film I see him in. Sadly, there is no UK Blu-ray release of this one, so I was lucky enough to get a hold of this imprint release from Australia, though there is also a Criterion release available in the US. Again, we have a film here that isn't perfect, but the number of times my jaw dropped while watching this film I'm not sure has been paralleled by any other movie I've ever seen. The most insane things, so entirely unexpected, just keep happening time and time again throughout this film, and you are really kept on your toes. And the pacing means you never get bored, it never allows your attention to wander or drift. You are just hooked as you're watching, as it keeps up its momentum. Being part of the Paranoia trilogy, as you might expect of course, there is a great mystery that runs throughout this one, which really keeps you engaged in the story. Beatty plays a reporter who is trying to unearth some murderous, conspiratorial and shadowy goings-on, and ends up getting embroiled in the mystery and the danger of it himself. There is one particular scene here revolving around a napkin that is pure Hitchcock, and it is bitingly tense. It's something so simple and in other circumstances could be utterly boring, but because the audience have been let in on some key information, the suspense is outrageously palpable. I thought this one was also very interestingly shot and lit. There is some brilliant use of shadow here, almost like a film noir, and it gives the film just a brilliant mood and atmosphere. I think my criticism of it would be that it does feel a bit less constructed or elaborate than I think it could have been, and perhaps should have been. So far from the paranoia films, I've only seen Klute, which I think perhaps is the superior film here, but it's hard to complain with the constant surprises that I didn't see coming at all, despite sussing out the ending quite early on. For me, I think it needed another 15 to 20 minutes perhaps, with some further threads being explored and more added elements to enhance the confusion. With that, I think it would have made this something spectacular, but even without it, it's still pretty great and another absolutely wild ride. Moving on, we have quite a change of pace with A Room with a View. From 1986 and directed by James Ivory, produced of course by Ismail Merchant, this one being one of the classic Merchant and Ivory films. It stars the young and very lovely Helena Bonham Carter, along with Julian Sands, who we sadly lost last year, Maggie Smith, who just recently passed away as well, and Denholm Elliott, Simon Callow, Daniel Day-Lewis, Judi Dench, and the list goes on. A really stellar cast for this one. Going into this one, I was expecting something of a tender romance, but in actual fact, this is much more along the lines of a comedy with some romance thrown in there. It was another film that I just had an absolute blast with, and that was enormous fun to watch. There is so much that is tongue-in-cheek and a lot of hilariously quotable lines. In particular, we have a different sort of role here for Daniel Day-Lewis, who plays this pompous, almost effete character, something of an upper-class dandy type, who whips out some great lines, like the one when he is asked what his profession is, and he says, I have no profession. My attitude, quite an indefensible one, is that so long as I'm no trouble to anyone, I have the right to do as I like. It is, I dare say, an example of my decadence. Absolutely hilarious, and he is constantly coming out with these great and ridiculous comments. He's also involved in one of the best kissing scenes I've ever seen, which has such a lovely and sweet run-up to it, and then is so unbelievably bad and awkward that I was tearing up with laughter and rewound it to watch it again. Absolutely glorious stuff. Simon Callow, who you might recognise from Four Weddings and a Funeral, or perhaps, if you're a person of culture like myself, from Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. He plays the local priest here and is also wonderful and provides plenty of the comic relief. There is another brilliant scene where a couple of the chaps are swimming/bathing in the nude and encourage the priest to join them, which results in a rip-roaringly fun time for them, splashing each other and running about wildly and stealing each other's clothes. Just boys being boys. And all topped off with even more hilarity that I won't spoil in case you haven't seen it yet. Well, I could go on and on about the various scenes here because there were just so many great ones. But of course, the romance at the heart of the story is a wonderful one too. In similar style to a novel of Jane Austen's, we have the classic battle between your heart and your head, between what society might say is the superior match to what maybe you truly want. Julian Sands and Helena Bonham Carter have a great and passionate chemistry that bubbles on screen, and they both do such a wonderful job together as we watch their will they won't they. Also, it was so nice to see Denholm Elliott, who you might recognise as Marcus Brody from the Indiana Jones films, in a different role here. I'm not sure I've ever seen him in anything else before, so it was really great to see him play a very different character. Overall, as you can probably tell, I had such a great time with this one, and it's a perfect film if you've had a bad day and need something to lift your spirits, because this will have you laughing out loud. Moving on then, and we come to my section on films that I haven't quite made my mind upon yet. That might have been particularly interesting or mysterious or just intriguing in some way. and I have a couple of those for this month. First up, we have Housekeeping, a film from 1987 and directed by Bill Forsyth. It stars Christine Lahti and as the girls Sarah Walker and Andrea Birdshill, both of whom sadly don't seem to have gone on to make any other films, despite both being pretty great here, which seems like a bit of a shame. This was a very curious watch that was incredibly atmospheric and interestingly told through some voiceovers. We follow the story of two young girls as they grow into teenagers. Suffice it to say that they have had a very rough and bumpy start to their young lives, and end up living in a small and quiet town with their grandmother, until, through a series of events which would undoubtedly lead to plenty of abandonment issues, they end up in the care of their mother's sister, Aunt Sylvie, played by Christine Lahti, who, shall we say, is not quite normal and has plenty of her own issues. The girls themselves have a very deep bond, really being the only points of consistency they've had in their young lives. But their aunt's presence proves dividing to a certain extent, and of course, as they are growing and maturing, that throws in other difficulties into things. It's a story that deals with ideas of compulsive behaviour, and reminded me in some ways of Agnes Varda's Vagabond, as this also delves into a rejection of society and normality. It also touches on areas to do with the importance of knowing our own history, who our parents, grandparents and ancestors were, and how that can inform who we become and how precious that information is. It also, of course, deals with parenting and a child-parent/carer relationship in depth here, and takes this on very interestingly from different angles. There is a great line that one of the girls says in a voiceover where she says, "It was pleasant when she scolded us for coming in late." It's a frustrating film in some ways though, as it perhaps does not provide the answers we're hoping for, or shall I say that I was hoping for. There is a lot of mystery here, and lots of it is left unsolved. I'm not even sure I liked it, in quotes so to speak. I found Sylvie a very difficult character to characterise, and couldn't ever really quite unravel her motivations, but this one really kept me hooked, and I was thinking about it for days afterwards. It's a film that I may well make a whole video on actually, as I'd like to get more into spoilers, which I always try to avoid in these videos. But the film itself is based on a book from 1980 written by Marilyn Robinson, and there is a great extra that Indicator have included, which is an interview with her from 2017 where she talks about the story, and that cleared up some of the points for me and made me look quite differently at the film, which is something I'd also like to talk about in more depth, but I'll save that for a later date. Overall, this was just incredibly engaging and strange and thought-provoking. It's certainly not one I'm likely to forget anytime soon. Next up, and we have the classic film The Maltese Falcon. From 1941 and directed by John Huston, it stars, of course, Humphrey Bogart, as well as Mary Astor, Gladys George, Peter Lorre, Elisha Cook Jr. and Sidney Greenstreet. Now, this was my third time watching the film, and it's been a film that I've struggled with before, struggled to like, let alone enjoy. I believe I got this DVD many years ago from my parents for a Christmas present, and I remember I was so excited to watch it. But I also remember being quite disappointed afterwards, considering how famous the film is and its standing. My second time watching it was when I bought this absolutely beautiful 4K steelbook, which was back in early 2023. I was so keen to revisit it after so long and see whether my thoughts had changed. But, to my surprise, I found they hadn't really. I again thought, it's just not that good. We have a convoluted story that just didn't capture my interest all that much for some reason, and it's not the easiest to follow with the characters that aren't all that compelling. And after that watch through, I was reading more about the film, and I saw that it was a big commercial and critical success when it was released in 1941, and of course I know a lot of people still love it now, so I thought, well, maybe this one is just one of those films that isn't for me, but I haven't given up on it. A few months ago, when I was perusing my new favourite bookshop in London, which is a Waterstones on Gower Street, which I can highly recommend if you ever find yourself nearby, I came across the original novel by Dashiell Hammett and decided to give it a go, as perhaps the novel itself would be a better read and help me to appreciate the film more. I really enjoy hard-boiled detective stories, and I remember I'd read The Big Sleep before I watched that film, and it really helped me enormously in following what was going on, as that one was also very convoluted. Well, I also did find some difficulty with the book, but actually really quite enjoyed it overall, and it of course spurred me on to give the film another try. Third time's the charm, as they say. Well, as you might have guessed it, considering I'm talking about it in my section on films that I haven't quite made my mind upon yet, it still didn't quite fully gel for me, but I did enjoy it much more than I have done previously. I certainly had a better grip on the story and the overall direction of things, so I'd say reading the book actually helped massively. I found some of the casting to be absolute perfection and some to be way off. Peter Lorre is entirely the book's character, it could not be more spot on, and the same goes for Sydney Greenstreet. But then we have the character of Wilma Cook, who is a teenager in the book, in the film played by a 38-year-old Elisha Cook Jr., and it just doesn't work at all for me, and I'm still not that keen on Mary Astor in her role. The only miscast that I think works decently is Humphrey Bogart himself, who embodies Sam Spade very well, despite being probably a foot shorter and a lot slimmer. Even though it's a fairly short book, it was really interesting what they left out and what they kept in. But overall, I'd say the film is up to about a 3.75 out of 5 for me. But it's one that I intend on watching many more times over the years. And perhaps, like olives or a good whiskey, this is one that I'll acquire a taste for as time goes on. And lastly then, that brings us on to my honourable mentions. First up we have Guns at Battersea, which I really enjoyed, and it's a film which has a fantastic performance from Richard Attenborough. Then, with another military film, we have The Long Grey Line, which came so close to being something fantastic, but just lost its way a little bit during the third act in its quite long 2 hours 20-minute runtime. Next we have Dante's Peak, which I hadn't seen for many years, but was just as good as I remembered. It's nothing spectacular, but it's a fun disaster film that makes some great use of miniatures. And lastly we have Freud. Not quite as good as I was hoping it would be, but still, a stellar performance from the always great Montgomery Clift, and a very interesting story. And well, that brings us to the end of the video and my October in film. In October last year, I was actually away travelling around Europe, and I watched only one film for the entire month because of that. And I've actually spent a lot of October this year, and also November as well, thinking about what a big difference a year can make, and what huge changes it can bring. Well, I hope your October was a month full of great films, and I hope you've had a lovely November as well. And if you're in the UK, I hope you've been wrapping up warmly, because my goodness are we into winter coat weather now. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.